Hello, very beautiful community. A couple of you have asked me to say something about the extraordinary act of journalistic vandalism that Jeff Bezos has engaged in the Washington Post. So let me try to say a couple of words about that just to help us ground the way in which it's really damaging for US democracy. This is a really difficult time for newspapers. It's a time in which making the financial model makes sense while also doing responsible journalism that speaks to one's country as a whole. That's an incredibly difficult equation today that we're really struggling with. It's much less doable than it was 10, 20 years ago. We've also got, in sheer numbers, less good quality journalism integrated within single institutions than we did 10, 20 years ago. We've got a lot of very interesting, very exciting projects that have a particular brief. But the problem for democracy is that you really need large institutions that are highly competent across a whole range of modes of journalism and subjects. If you don't have that, you've basically not got a very central tool that any democracy needs for it to be able to speak to itself about itself properly. And that's why if you take a good, highly responsible newspaper that, let's say, has 700 journalists, and you break it up and you give each individual journalist a Substack, well, they aren't going to become less good journalists overnight, but the benefit to the culture here will be severely reduced. So let's sort of facetiously quantify this. If the value of the newspaper when it's integrated with these 700 journalists is 100%, you're not going to get 70 or 80 if they all individually go on to Substack. You're going to get about 10% of the benefit, I'm afraid to say. Now, that is different if these are purely opinion journalists. If you move 700 opinion journalists to Substack, you're going to take a loss, but it won't be as catastrophic. But other types of journalism mean that the loss is going to be huge. Key example here is investigative journalism, which is impossible outside institutions. Take a brilliant investigative journalist, you put him on Substack, nothing's going to happen. Not really. You could imagine a counterexample, but the circumstances would really have to be quite exceptional. Because that's the kind of journalism that needs a team. It needs resources. It needs time, 18 months to do something that may or may not yield good results. And you need culture, which is in this context going to be in part a commitment to making sure that you don't get untruthful. If your 18-month project is not going very well and you're tempted to cut a few corners or make a few connections that aren't plausible to make the project sound like it's landed. So this is a collective enterprise that requires an ethics within a culture. It requires a lot of people. It requires time. It requires money. You're not going to have that. You're not going to have that at a small newspaper, and you're not going to have that at a Substack sort of setup. So that's the problem we've got. The notion that it's all okay because everybody's going to have their own YouTube channel, it doesn't work unless you're purely talking about opinion commentary, right? And what am I doing? I'm doing opinion commentary and some developmental commentary, which is about you developing your relationship with how to be more truthful. So that's okay, but that's not what the core of journalism is. And the core of journalism is devastated if you've just got Substacks and YouTube channels. So that's the kind of context we're in. What did Bezos do? Bezos essentially let go around $300 100 journalists from the Washington Post, which is a very significant percentage relative to the total number of people they've got. I haven't checked what the number is, but we're really talking about, perhaps a third of all the journalists in the paper going, if not more. And essentially, the paper has had financial difficulties, although that kind of sounds ludicrous because all of these difficulties amount to a sort of a rounding error in the context of Bezos' wealth. But there hasn't been any serious top-down attempt to solve these problems. Nor is there any sign whatever that Bezos is particularly interested in quality journalism, or that he's particularly interested in quality journalism as a central part of a democratic culture. In other words, essentially the paper is a tool for Bezos to meet certain needs of his, in part needs for political access. If he were civic spirited about this, he might do something like what the Scott family did in the 30s with The Guardian, which is put aside a lot of money into a trust to secure the future of the newspaper, beyond your own involvement with it, but making sure that irresponsible people don't come along and do something bad with it. He certainly has the resources to do that, but he's not remotely interested in that. And so they've closed their Ukraine desk, as far as I can see, completely. They got rid of the bureau chief in India, in 7 other countries. So there's an unbelievable contraction. It's a devastation. It's a devastation. So what are the consequences of this? What are the lessons from it? Number one, we've got a devastation of a major US democratic institution that has a great history and can't just be recreated. These institutions are either sustained or they lapse, but you can't just go away and start your own Washington Post somewhere. So this is a disaster for the Post. 2, it's a disaster for US democratic culture, because there's so many wonderful people leaving the Post now, and they're saying, well, I'm not even sure what I'm going to do. Some of them are going to go to some big publications like the NYT. Others are going to go to Substack. God knows what's going to happen. They are probably going to be mostly all right. But that's not the point. The point is them being mostly all right in different little silos is not even 20% of a compensation for what was the 100% value of them being inside that single institution. So it's a hit for the capacity of the United States to talk to itself about itself politically. But it's also a big civilizational hit for the United States and for everybody in the West and indeed in the world. Because what happens when such a contraction occurs is that we just have less access to help us figure out what the hell is going on in India, what the hell is going on in China. So we just know less about the world. Now, Washington Post is not the only paper to have good journalists working on important parts of the world. But cumulatively, in the scheme of things, it's a big loss, right? You do not have papers in Europe that can compensate easily for that kind of loss. When journalists all over the world work, they want to discover what's going on a particular issue. They're going to look first to the New York Times and the Washington Post. It doesn't matter if the Post and the Times do a lot of things really badly. It doesn't matter if they're not speaking to the country as a whole as they should. There's plenty of disasters and flaws there. But the point is, at the level of breadth and depth and budget and power, these are very unique institutions globally, right? It's not just disaster for Washington that it's going to be a capital without its newspaper in a proper sense. It's a global impoverishment. It's a civilizational hit because we know now less about what's going on in the world, and that's not just, if you like, practically damaging. We know how it's practically damaging. We learn that from dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, right? Look at the Putin regime. One of its problems is that it doesn't know what the hell is going on in Ukraine properly. It doesn't know what the hell is going on in Russia properly, in part because it can't turn to journalists and ask. Western journalists don't have access, and Russian journalists have been asphyxiated. So in part, it just means you can't read the world properly. But that's not quite what I'm saying. I'm saying that the civilizational hit is that I think that if we don't know what's happening in China, if we don't know what's happening in Iran, if we don't know what's happening in India to the degree to which we could know it before, let's say it's a 10% hit, 5% hit, as far as the cumulative newspaper-derived access to political reality goes globally. It's a bit of civilizational damage, because if we know less about that, we can't make these kinds of judgments of comparison about what's happening here versus what's happening there versus what's happening to us. And thereby our sense of who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going is constricted. So that's the kind of reality of oligarchic vandalism. Lots of love, beautiful community.